Around the year 362 AD, the most powerful man on earth sat down and wrote an angry letter. His name was Julian, Emperor of Rome, and he had spent his short reign trying to pull the empire back to its old gods and away from the Christian faith. He had the army, he had the treasury, he had every pagan temple from Britain to Persia on his side. And in this letter, written to one of his own priests, he admits what is beating him. He is losing to a group of people he refuses to even call by their name. These impious Galileans, he writes, feed not only their own poor, but ours as well. Read that again. The Emperor of Rome, complaining that his enemies love strangers better than his own religion, loves its friends. He could fight their arguments. He could not fight the way they treated people. Now, come forward 17 centuries. A church hallway in America. Sunday morning, 11:15. The last song has ended, and the room is full of coffee and conversation. A newcomer stands alone by the welcome table, holding a cup nobody offered him. Two women who have known each other for 20 years pass without eye contact. Because of something that happened in March. Everyone in this room just sang about love. And an emperor who died 1600 years ago would walk through this hallway and feel safe. Something the Roman Empire could not answer has gotten hard to see. The answer was never complicated. It is 2 sentences, and Jesus called them the greatest commandments. And most people watching this can quote both from memory. That is exactly the problem. Knowing them was never the hard part. It is the last week of Jesus of Nazareth's life, and he knows it. The city is Jerusalem, swollen to several times its normal size for Passover. Pilgrims have walked for days from Galilee, from Syria, from Egypt, and every one of them has pushed through the same gates into the temple courts. A stone plaza, vast enough to hold thousands. The air smells of livestock and burning fat. Somewhere behind the crowd, the altar fire never goes out, and the smoke from it rises all day over the sound of money changers and bleating animals and 100 arguments in 3 languages. In the middle of that noise, a carpenter's son from the north is teaching, and the men who run the temple want him dead. They cannot simply arrest him. The crowd loves him, and Jerusalem at Passover is a city one spark away from a riot, with Roman soldiers watching from the fortress wall on the north side of the courts. So they choose a different weapon. They send men to ask him questions in public. Not honest questions, loaded ones, built the way a trap is built, where every available answer costs him something. The first group asks about taxes. Should we pay the tax to Caesar or not? Feel the teeth in that one. Sigh yes. And the crowd hears a collaborator, a friend of the occupiers who bleed them every harvest. Say no. And the men watching from the fortress hear sedition. And sedition ends on a cross. He slips it. Show me the coin, he says. Whose image is on it? Give Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and give God what belongs to God. The record says they were amazed, and they left him. The second group comes with a theology puzzle. The Sadducees, the temple aristocracy, men who did not believe in resurrection at all. They spin a story about a woman widowed 7 times and ask whose wife she will be in a resurrection they consider a fairy tale. The question is designed to make the whole idea sound ridiculous. He answers it so cleanly that some of the legal experts standing nearby, men from the rival party, say out loud, Well spoken. Teacher, 2 traps, 2 escapes. The crowd is leaning in now. The way a crowd gathers around any public contest, keeping score. Then a third man steps forward. And this one is a professional. He is a scribe, an expert in the law of Moses, a man who has spent his entire adult life inside the text. And his question sounds, at first, like the safest one yet. Teacher, which commandment is the greatest? Here is why it is not safe. The law of Moses was not a short document. The rabbis of later tradition would count 613 commandments in it, covering everything from murder to mildew, from adultery to the fringe on a garment. And the men of Jesus' day were already deep in the argument that count came from. Which commandments were heavy, which were light? Rabbi Hillel's school and Rabbi Shammai's school had gone around on questions like this for 100 years, and disciples still lined up behind each name. So the question is a net. Pick one commandment out of hundreds, and you have publicly ranked everything else beneath it. Whatever you leave out, someone in this courtyard has built his life on. Elevate the wrong thing, neglect the sacred thing, and the men taking notes will carry your answer to people who can use it. The whole plaza waits. The smoke keeps rising off the altar, and Jesus answers the question. He gives the man one commandment, the greatest, exactly what was asked for. Then he keeps talking. Nobody asked him a second question. He gives a second answer anyway. And that unrequested sentence is the reason this video exists. The first half of the answer surprised no one in that courtyard. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God. The Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. Every man standing there had known those words since before he could read. It is the Shema, the opening of Deuteronomy chapter 6. And it was the most familiar sentence in the Jewish world. Fathers taught it to children at bedtime. The devout recited it twice a day, morning and evening, every day of their lives. Men bound it in small leather boxes to their arm and forehead when they prayed, and fixed it in a case on the doorframe of the house, so that a person touched the love of God on the way in and on the way out. If you had polled that courtyard, the Shema wins. Safe answer. The scribe nods. The trap has not closed. Then Jesus says a word that changes the shape of the whole exchange. And the second is like it. Nobody asked for a second. The question was singular. Which commandment is the greatest? And any answer beyond the first is a risk he chose to take. He reaches back into the law, past the famous passages, into the book of Leviticus, chapter 19, and pulls out one sentence buried in a list of workaday rules. Pay your hired worker before sundown. Do not curse the deaf. Do not put a stumbling block in front of the blind. Leave the edges of your field unharvested so the poor can eat. And right there, in the middle of that list, this, love your neighbor as yourself. That sentence was not obscure. The rabbis knew it and honored it. What no teacher had done, not Hillel, not Shammai, not anyone whose words survive, was welded to the Shema and called the two of them one thing: love God, love neighbor. And the second is like the first. He then drives a nail through both. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. The whole legal universe, those scribes had mapped their lives onto, hanging from two hooks. The surprise standing in that courtyard was never that Jesus named two commandments. The surprise is that he refused to let anyone separate them. He was handed a ranking question, and he came back with a welding job. From that moment on, in his teaching, you do not get to have one without the other. There is no version of loving God that leaves you free to step around the person next to you. Now watch the scribe, because what he does next almost never gets preached. Mark's gospel keeps the moment. The scribe, the man sent forward in a courtyard full of traps, looks at Jesus and agrees with him. Well said, Teacher, God is one, and to love him with all your heart and to love your neighbor as yourself is more important than all burnt offerings and sacrifices. Stop and hear where he is standing when he says that. He is inside the temple courts. The altar is burning behind him. The smoke of the sacrifices is in his lungs while he speaks. Priests are working the fire a stone's throw away. And this expert in the law says, out loud, in that place, that loving God and loving your neighbor outweighs everything on that altar. It is one of the bravest sentences anyone speaks in the entire gospel record. And Jesus looks at this man, this scribe from the delegation that came to trap him, and gives him something he gives no one else in any gospel. You are not far, he says, from the kingdom of God. Not far. Sit with the strangeness of that. Not far means close. Not far also means not yet there. The man knows the right answer. He can recite it, defend it, rank it correctly in front of a hostile crowd, and knowing it has carried him near the doorway, and knowing it has not carried him through. Whatever ground remains between that scribe and the kingdom, it is not more information. He has all the information. Something else covers the last distance. Mark never tells us his name. Mark never tells us whether he crossed. The record simply lets him go. An expert in the law, standing in temple smoke, with the right answer in his mouth. Some unmeasured distance from home. Keep him in view. This whole video is about the ground between him and the door, because every Christian community on earth is standing on it. Before this goes one step further, a question has to be answered honestly. When Jesus said, "Love the Lord your God," what did the word love mean to the people standing there? Because in modern American English, love is a feeling. It is warmth, affection, a swelling in the chest during the third song of the worship set. And if that is what the first commandment requires, then the commandment rises and falls with your mood. And there are entire seasons of an ordinary life. Grief, exhaustion, dry months when God feels far away, in which the greatest commandment would simply be out of reach. The people in that courtyard heard something different, because they knew where the sentence came from, and they knew what surrounded it. Go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6 and read what comes right after, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart." Moses does not follow it with instructions about feelings. He follows it with a schedule. These commandments are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road. When you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the doorframes of your houses and on your gates. Look at the verbs: sit, walk, lie down, get up, teach, talk, tea, write. There is not one feeling word in the entire list. Moses takes the love of God and immediately nails it into the four most ordinary moments a human day contains. The moment you sit down, the moment you travel, the moment you go to bed, the moment you wake up, loving God. In the passage Jesus quoted is not a temperature. It is an architecture. It is what a life looks like when it has been organized around someone. And ancient Israel took the architecture literally, in ways you could touch. The small leather boxes from the last chapter. The tefillin, bound to the arm and the forehead, held these exact words on tiny parchment scrolls. The case on the doorframe, the mezuzah, held them too, which means a devout household physically brushed past the love of God every single time anyone walked in or out of the house. Coming home from the market, there it is at the door. Leaving for the fields before dawn, there it is again. The commandment was installed in the traffic pattern of the home, on purpose, so that loving God would be as hard to forget as the door itself. Notice what that design assumes. It assumes forgetting is the danger, not hatred of God, not rebellion, just the quiet drift of a busy life. Moses says it plainly a few verses later. When you have eaten and are satisfied, when your houses are full and your herds grow large, be careful that you do not forget the Lord. The whole apparatus, the boxes, the doorposts, the twice daily recitation exists because love that is only a feeling evaporates, and love that is built into the structure of a day survives. Now bring that definition forward and stand it next to a modern Sunday. An American Christian can sing for 20 minutes. I feel genuine warmth. Drive home and have the entire experience leave no fingerprint on Monday. By the standard of Deuteronomy chapter 6, the singing was never the commandment. The singing is the doorframe with nothing written on it. The first commandment was always asking a bigger question. Where does God show up in your Tuesday? In how the household money moves. In what the children absorb at the dinner table. In what you reach for first when you wake up. A phone gets that last slot in most American homes now. And the phone did not even have to fight for it. None of this is said to shame anyone. It is said to measure the commandment accurately, because the courtyard is about to teach us that the measurement has a second instrument, loving God with heart, soul, mind, and strength means a life arranged around Him, woven into sitting and walking and lying down and getting up. That is the claim. And the moment you state the claim, a hard problem appears. An arranged life is still mostly invisible. Nobody can see your heart. Nobody can audit your soul. A man can recite the Shema twice a day with the boxes on his arm and the scroll on his doorframe and be hollow at the center. And from the street, his house looks exactly like the house of a man on fire for God. Every religious practice in that courtyard could be performed. The recitation, the boxes, the sacrifices, climbing the altar in smoke, all of it could be done flawlessly by a heart that loved nothing but itself. Which raises the question the whole ancient world had no answer for. If the first commandment lives on the inside, how would anyone, including you, ever know it was real? Jesus answered that question in the courtyard. The answer is the reason He refused to stop at one commandment. Every serious claim needs a way to be tested. That is true in a courtroom, in a laboratory, in a marriage. A claim that can never be checked against anything is not a strong claim. It is just a noise a person makes. I love God is a claim, and it has a testing problem, because the evidence is sealed inside the one person making the claim. Church attendance does not settle it, because attendance can be habit. Bible knowledge does not settle it, because the scribe in the courtyard had more Bible knowledge than anyone watching this video. And Jesus told him he was still standing outside the kingdom. Emotion during worship does not settle it, because emotion also shows up at concerts and football games, and nobody calls that covenant love. Everything a religious person can point to as proof of the first commandment can be manufactured without it. The ancient world understood this problem. It just could not solve it. Jesus solved it in one move. And the move was the welding job from chapter 2. The second is like the first. Love your neighbor as yourself. He took the invisible commandment and bolted a visible one to it. And from that moment, the claim "I love God" had something it could be checked against. You cannot see a heart. You can absolutely see how a man treats his neighbor. You can watch it in a hallway. You can watch it at a table. Whoever gets ignored, whoever gets welcomed, whoever gets talked about after they leave the room, all of it is public. All of it is observable, and none of it can hide. The second commandment is the first commandment made visible. That is why they cannot be separated. Split them apart, and the first one becomes untestable. A private glow that demands nothing and proves nothing. Keep them welded, and the first one suddenly has a witness that follows you around all week. About 30 years after the courtyard, one of the men who heard Jesus teach wrote this logic down in its sharpest form. The Apostle John, an old man by then, the last living witness of that generation, put it in a letter with no cushion around it. Whoever claims to love God yet hates a brother or sister is a liar. For whoever does not love their brother and sister, whom they have seen, cannot love God, whom they have not seen. Aliyar. John was the disciple of love, the gentlest voice in the New Testament, and this is the hardest word he ever used. And look at his reasoning, because it is not an insult. It is arithmetic. The brother is visible. God is invisible. Loving the visible person is the beginner course. If a man is failing the course he can see, his claim to be passing the course he cannot see is not credible testimony. John does not say the man is confused, or immature, or growing. He says the claim is false, because love that exists nowhere visible does not exist. Now be careful, because this cuts in a direction most sermons never follow it. The test does not just apply to one person. It applies to a room. A community makes the same claim an individual makes. We love God. It is printed in the mission statement, sung in the songs, spoken from the platform. And that community claim has the same testing problem and the same solution. You cannot see a congregation's collective heart. You can see its hallway. You can see who stands alone at the welcome table and for how long. You can see which names come up in the parking lot and what gets said about them. You can see whether the two women from March have been left to avoid each other for years, while everyone politely notices nothing. The hallway is the heart, developed like a photograph, which means Julian the emperor, without knowing it, was running the exact test Jesus installed. He could not see whether Christians loved their God. Nobody can see that. He watched them feed strangers, and he wrote his angry letter, because the visible half of the world told him what the invisible half contained. The test worked. It worked for a hostile witness who wanted it to fail. So the first commandment has a witness now, and the witness is the neighbor. Love God, love neighbor, one welded thing. And the second half is where the first half shows. But notice the trap door in that sentence. Everything now hangs on one word, and the word is neighbor. Define it narrowly enough, and the test gets easy. If my neighbor means my family, my friends, the people in my small group who are pleasant to me, then I am passing already. And so is nearly everyone. And the greatest commandments shrink into a congratulation. A lawyer in Luke's gospel saw that trapdoor immediately. He was a professional, trained to find the load-bearing word in any statute. And he found this one on the first read. So he asked Jesus the question that decides everything. The question this entire commandment stands or falls on. And who is my neighbor? He was not asking for information. He was asking for a boundary. He wanted to know where the obligation ends, which is a polite way of asking who I am allowed to walk past. Jesus answered him with a road, 17 miles of it, downhill all the way, through country where travelers disappeared. That road is the next chapter. The road from Jerusalem to Jericho was 17 miles long, and every mile of it went down. Jerusalem sits high in the Judean hills, about 2,500 feet above sea level. Jericho sits near the Dead Sea, more than 800 feet below it. So, a traveler dropped over 3,000 feet in a single day's walk, out of the cool stone city and down through a landscape that turns hostile fast. Limestone cliffs, dry ravines, switchbacks where the road bends blind around rock walls, and caves in the hills above with sightlines down onto every bend. The locals had a name for one stretch of it, the Ascent of Blood. Travelers moved through in groups when they could, because a man alone on that road was advertising. That is the road Jesus chose for his answer. Remember what he was answering. A lawyer, an expert in the law, had stood up and asked, "Who is my neighbor?" And underneath the question sat a colder one. Where does my responsibility end? Every legal mind works this way. And it is not evil. It is the job. Define the term. Draw the perimeter. Tell me who is inside my obligation so I can also know who is outside it. The lawyer wanted a fence, and he wanted to know exactly where it stood, because a duty without limits is a frightening thing to a careful man. Jesus does not hand him a definition. He hands him a body on the ground. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, he says, and he fell into the hands of robbers. They stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Notice what the stripping does inside the story. Clothes, in that world, told you what a man was, his region, his class, his people, whether he was one of yours. This man has no clothes and no voice, just wounds. He has been reduced to the one thing the robbers could not take, a human being. Category unknown. Whoever comes down that road next will not be able to check his credentials before deciding. They will only see a person. A priest comes down the road. He sees the man, and he crosses to the other side and keeps walking. Then a Levite, a man who served in the temple. Same road, same body. He crosses over too. Now hold on, because the modern reader hears those two verses and files both men under villain. And that filing misses the blade Jesus hid in the story. Luke never tells us why they crossed over. He did not have to, because every listener on that hillside could supply the reasons themselves. A priest who touched a corpse became ritually unclean, and this body, half dead, motionless, could be a corpse from 20 feet away. Unclean meant excluded from temple service. Unable to do the work God had assigned him. And everyone knew the other thing. The thing nobody had to say out loud. A body on that road could be bait, with armed men in the rocks waiting to see who stops. So the crowd did not hear monsters walking past. They heard men with schedules and duties and defensible concerns. Weighing it all the way, you weigh the figure standing at a highway exit with a sign and letting the weighing carry them past. On the far side of the road where the question could not look at them. That is the blade. Jesus built the story so that stepping around a broken person would look reasonable. Defensible. Even faithful. The men who passed were religious professionals on their way to do godly work. Then he sent a third man down the road. A Samaritan. The word landed in that audience like a slap. To a first-century Jewish crowd, Samaritans were not a quaint minority. They were the enemy next door, half-breeds and heretics in the popular mind. 5 centuries of hatred between the two peoples. Arriba al temple. Old massacres in both directions. Some Jewish travelers walked days out of their way, crossing the Jordan River twice, just to avoid setting foot in Samaria. Jesus takes that man, the wrong man, the man his audience would trust least on a dangerous road, and gives him the whole rest of the story. The Samaritan sees the body, and Luke records his reaction in one Greek word, splanchnizomai. It means he was moved in his gut, not his opinion. His stomach. Compassion in the ancient world was located in the body. The physical lurch you feel when you see a hurt child. And that lurch is the hinge of the entire parable. Because it is the one thing on that road the other 2 men managed to override. Then watch what the feeling does. Because Jesus itemizes it like a receipt. The Samaritan goes to him, closes the distance the other 2 kept, bandages his wounds, pours on oil and wine, his own supplies, carried for his own journey, puts the man on his own animal, which means the Samaritan now walks the bandit road on foot, slowed to a crawl, exposed, brings him to an inn and stays the night caring for him. And in the morning he takes out 2 denarii, 2 full days of a laborer's wages, hands them to the innkeeper, and says the sentence that should end every argument about what love costs. Look after him, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense. An open tab for a stranger from an enemy. Count what the story just spent. Time. A day, at least. Probably 2. Money. With no ceiling on it. Safety. On the worst road in the region. And the man he spent it on, as far as the Samaritan knew, was a Jew. A member of the people who despised him. A man who, had he been conscious, might have refused the help. Then Jesus turns to the lawyer and does the thing that makes this parable dangerous instead of sweet. The lawyer asked, "Who is my neighbor?" Jesus asks him back, "Which of these 3 was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers?" Look at what happened to the question. It came in asking about the man on the ground. Does he qualify? Is he inside my fence? It comes back asking about the men on the road. The category the lawyer wanted to define was never the wounded man's category. It was his own. Neighbor is not a status the other person has to prove. It is a decision you make standing over them. The Samaritan did not check whether the body qualified. He became the neighbor, on the spot, at his own expense. The lawyer cannot even say the word Samaritan out loud. He answers, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus releases him with 5 words that close the fence question forever. Go and do likewise. There is no perimeter. That is the answer. The lawyer asked where love could stop, and Jesus told him a story in which it does not. Every generation reads that parable and puts the Samaritan somewhere safe. Time did most of the work. Say Good Samaritan today, and Americans hear a compliment. It is the name of hospitals, of laws that protect bystanders, of charities with gentle logos. The word that hit a first-century crowd like a slap now sounds like a merit badge. And a story built to offend has been worn smooth into a story about being nice. So run the test that restores the edge. The Samaritan was not a generic kind stranger. He was the specific category of person the audience had spent their lives learning to distrust. Wrong ethnicity, wrong theology, wrong history, with real grievances running in both directions. Old blood, old insults, a rivalry with actual bodies in it. Jesus reached for the most loaded category his audience owned and made that man the hero, and made the respectable religious men the ones who walked past. Now, aim the same story at an American church hallway, because that is where this video lives. Nobody needs help loving the people they would have chosen anyway. The small group that shares your stage of life, the friends who vote like you, worship like you, raise kids like you. Affection inside a matched set is real, and it is also easy. And Jesus said out loud that it proves almost nothing. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even tax collectors do that. The greatest commandments were never aimed at the people you would have chosen. They were aimed at the ones you would not. And every congregation in America contains them. Not hypothetically, specifically. The generational line runs right through the sanctuary. The 70-year-old man who thinks the new music sounds like a concert and misses the hymns that carried him through his wife's death. The 24-year-old who finds the old service lifeless and cannot say so without being told she wants entertainment. Each one is the other's Samaritan. The person whose whole way of loving God feels wrong. The class line runs through the parking lot before anyone reaches the door. The family that arrives in a car with a rattle in it, whose kids wear what the church closet had in their size. The couple 2 rows up whose vacation photos from Italy came up on the lobby screen during the announcements. They shake hands at the greeting time. Neither has ever been inside the other's house. The line of background, the woman who grew up in a tradition this congregation quietly considers barely Christian, who still crosses herself sometimes out of 40 years of habit, and catches someone noticing. The man who came out of no tradition at all, who does not know when to stand or what a benediction is, and who reads the small smile on the face next to him exactly right. The line of secondary conviction, the arguments that are not about whether Jesus rose, but about everything after. How to school the kids, what liberty permits, which teachers are trustworthy, end times charts. Every one of those lines has believers on both sides of it. And every one of them is a place where contempt has learned to dress up as discernment. And the line of personality, the least discussed and maybe the most common. The man who talks too long and stands too close. The woman whose anxiety fills a room. The person who is simply hard to be around, week after week. In a way no one can name and everyone can feel. There is no ministry program for this line. There is only the moment when they approach your circle in the hallway, and the circle either opens or performs its subtle close. Here is the sentence this chapter exists to say. It is easy to love humanity. Humanity never shows up needing a ride. Loving mankind, in the abstract, costs nothing and feels like virtue. The commandment never once mentions mankind. It says, neighbor, singular. The specific person God has allowed to stand in your actual path, with their specific voice and their specific politics and their specific way of chewing the ice in their cup. The parable was engineered to prevent the abstraction. A particular man, on a particular road, at a particular hour, needing particular hands. Go back to the hallway from the beginning of this video. The newcomer is still standing at the welcome table, and now you can see him properly. He came alone, which is its own flag in a family church. His clothes are a little off the local code, too formal or not formal enough. It hardly matters which. During the music, he stood with his hands at his sides while the room lifted theirs. And in the sermon, he did not laugh at the joke everyone laughed at. Because it leaned on a shared memory he does not share. 3 people made eye contact with him this morning, and each one decided, in under a second, without a single conscious thought, that someone else would surely welcome him. He is not being persecuted. He is being weighed by kind people, the way the priest weighed the man on the road. Wrong fit, probably fine. Someone else's assignment. Every reason is small and defensible. And the sum of the reasons is a man standing alone with a cooling cup of coffee inside a building full of people singing about love. 17 centuries ago, the watching world could not explain what Christians did with people like him. That was the whole scandal. Strangers with nothing in common. The wrong people by every Roman measure. Treated like family at cost. An emperor complained about it in writing. The scandal was never that they agreed with each other. They often did not. And the next chapter is about exactly that. The scandal was what they did with the disagreement. Somewhere along the way, American Christians absorbed an idea that would have baffled the first church. The idea is that loving each other means agreeing with each other, and that a disagreement is therefore a small emergency, something to be smoothed over, avoided, or won. Watch what that idea does to a congregation. It teaches people to go quiet. The real conversations move to the parking lot, to the group text, to the kitchen after the guests leave. Anywhere but the room where the other side might hear. The church stays pleasant on the surface, and underneath the pleasantness, people slowly sort themselves into camps of the like-minded, until one day the disagreement surfaces over a budget or a building or a hire, and everyone is shocked by the size of the thing that was growing in the dark. The first churches did not have the luxury of that idea, because the first churches were the strangest social experiment in the ancient world. In Rome, in Corinth, in Antioch, the gospel had thrown together people who had no business sharing a table, Jews who had kept kosher their entire lives, and Gentiles who had eaten in pagan temples the year before, slaves and the men who owned slaves, people who had memorized the law of Moses and people who could not name the 12 tribes. Rome sorted every one of those categories into ranks. The church seated them in one room and called them brothers. And then the argument started, because of course they did. Romans chapter 14 is Paul writing into one of those arguments. And the details are worth hearing because they sound so small and cut so deep. Some believers in Rome ate meat. Others ate only vegetables. Almost certainly because most meat in a Roman market had passed through a pagan temple on its way to the butcher. and they could not put idle meat in their mouths and feel clean before God. Some kept the old sacred days. Others treated every day alike. Both sides had reasons. Both sides had scripture. And both sides had begun doing the thing that human beings always do with a disagreement. Each had turned its position into a badge, and the other side into a problem. Now watch what Paul does. Because it is not what either camp wanted. They wanted a ruling. He had the authority to give one. An apostle. The man who wrote half their New Testament. He could have settled the menu in one sentence. He refuses. Instead, he names the two weapons each side has been using, and he takes both away. To the strong, the meat-eaters, the ones confident in their freedom, he says, "Do not treat with contempt." That was their weapon. Contempt. The little laugh. The roll of the eyes. The word legalist deployed like a fly swatter. Paul saw it and banned it. To the careful, the abstainers, the ones certain that faithfulness meant restraint, he says, "Do not judge." That was their weapon. Judgment. The raised eyebrow. The question mark over another believer's salvation. The quiet file kept on who does what. Banned as well. Then he gives the reason. And the reason is the whole chapter. Who are you to judge someone else's servant? To their own master. Servants stand or fall. The person across the aisle from you does not answer to you. They answer to the same Lord you answer to. And he has welcomed them. Which means the question of their standing was settled at a level above your opinion. You are not the judge in this courtroom. You are the other defendant. Notice what Paul never says. He never says the disagreement does not matter. He never tells the vegetable eaters to loosen up or the meat eaters to abstain for the sake of peace. He assumes the two camps will still be two camps next week. Still eating differently. Still convinced. Full conviction. He says, each in their own mind. The love he is commanding is not the love that ends the argument. It is the love that survives it. That is a skill. And like every skill, it needs a drill. So here is one. And this video will come back to it. Because it fits in a pocket. The next time a disagreement starts heating up with a fellow believer over anything, before you compose the reply, ask two questions in order. First, what does loving God require here? And be honest, because the answer usually includes truth. It includes saying what you actually believe instead of what keeps the peace. Loving God has never meant pretending. And a church where nobody says anything real is not united. It is sedated. Second, what does loving my neighbor require here? And be honest again. Because the answer usually includes their dignity. It means listening past the point where you have your comeback ready. It means representing their view in words they would recognize, instead of the weak version that is easy to beat. It means no contempt, even in the privacy of your own chest. Because contempt always leaks. Two questions, both of them, in that order. Every time, answer only the first and you become a crusader. Write about the issue and ruinous to the room. Answer only the second and you become an appeaser. Warm, agreeable, and useless to anyone who needed the truth. The commandments come welded. The questions do too. But say those two questions out loud in a real church. And watch what happens. Somewhere in the room, a hand goes up, and behind the hand is a story. And the story has a bruise in it. Because there is a way to preach love your neighbor that hands the worst people in the room a set of keys. What about the member whose disagreement is not honest, but cruel? What about the man everyone is a little afraid of? The one this teaching keeps ordering people back into the path of. If love has no fence around the argument, does it have any fence at all? The answer is yes, and it comes from the life of Jesus himself. And it is the part of his example that almost never makes it into the stained glass. There is a picture of Jesus that lives in the American imagination, assembled from children's books and soft paintings. And in the picture, he is endlessly available. He turns no one away. He absorbs whatever is done to him. He answers every question, accepts every demand, stands in the open with his arms out. And from that picture, a rule gets extracted and laid on ordinary believers, usually the tender-hearted ones. If you were really loving, you would put up with it, whatever it is, however long it lasts. The picture is wrong, and it is worth walking through the gospel record slowly to see how wrong, because the actual Jesus had edges the paintings never show. He walked away from crowds. Luke says it plainly, and says it was a pattern. Crowds of needy people, real sickness, real desperation, pressing in from every town. And the verse says, Jesus often withdrew to lonely places and prayed. Often, while there were still people in line, the neediness in front of him did not automatically own his next hour. He answered to his Father, and some days his Father said, "Come away." And he went. He refused to answer questions. Stand him before the men interrogating him and watch. When Herod peppered him with questions, hoping for a performance, Jesus gave him nothing at all. When the temple leadership demanded to know by what authority he acted, he set a condition first, answered their evasion with silence, and closed the conversation. He could tell an honest question from a trap by its smell, and he did not owe the trap an answer. There were men in front of him he simply declined to engage. He named what people were doing while they were doing it. Read Matthew 23 with the volume it was spoken at. Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites, said in public, to their faces. With the crowd listening, he called them whitewashed tombs. This was not a loss of temper. It was a diagnosis delivered out loud, because the men in question were shutting the door of the kingdom in people's faces. And love for the people at the door required saying so to the men blocking it. And once, famously, he made a whip. The tables in the temple courts, the ones that turned prayer into a market, went over. Coins on the stones, livestock driven out. This is the same man, in the same week, as the courtyard conversation about love. Now put the pieces on the table and say what they add up to. The most loving man who ever lived withdrew, refused, confronted, and overturned. Which means whatever love is, it is not unlimited access. The idea that a truly loving person can be reached at all times, imposed on without limit, and mistreated without response is not from the Gospels. Jesus loved with his whole self and remained entirely in possession of himself. And no one, not the crowds, not the family that came to collect him, not the killers, took his choices from him. Even at the end, he said, "No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord." His sacrifice was a decision, made freely, from strength. That is what made it love instead of defeat. So here is where this lands in a church hallway. And it needs to be said carefully, because real people are carrying real versions of this. There is a woman who has been told that going back to a dangerous house is what forgiveness looks like. There is a volunteer who has learned that saying no to a fourth ministry role will be read as a spiritual problem. There is a man whose brother has burned him in the same way 11 times, and who has been informed that setting any condition on the 12th chance would be unchristian. In every one of those cases, the greatest commandments are being quoted. And in every one of those cases, they are being quoted wrong. Love your neighbor as yourself. The last two words have been sitting in that sentence the whole time. As yourself. The commandment assumes the person doing the loving also counts. That their body, their sanity, their children are also under God's care and also worth protecting. A reading of the verse that produces one person slowly being destroyed for another person's convenience has not understood the verse. It has weaponized it. And so, some distinctions, stated plainly, because confusion here wrecks lives. Protecting yourself from ongoing harm is not hatred. The commandment never required you to stay in range. Requiring accountability is not vengeance. Naming what happened. Involving others when it is serious. Expecting change before access is restored. All of that is treating a person as a responsible adult, which is a form of respect. Indulgence is what you extend to someone you have given up on. And a boundary is not the opposite of love. Sometimes it is the only thing love has left. When a man's sin is destroying him and everyone near him, the person who finally says, "I love you and I will not participate in this any longer," is not abandoning him. She is often the first person in years to take him seriously. One more distinction belongs in this chapter, and it is the one the church gets wrong at the highest cost. Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing, and they do not run on the same clock. Forgiveness is something you give. Trust is something the other person rebuilds. Those two sentences are going to matter enormously a few chapters from now. When this video walks into the hardest room in Christian life, the room where the person who hurt you is a believer, maybe a leader, maybe someone you once prayed beside, hold the distinction. We will need it there, because everything so far has assumed the danger comes from difficult individuals. The harder truth is that whole communities drift into a quieter kind of harm. One nobody chooses and nobody notices. A congregation can be friendly, generous, doctrinally sound, and blind, not blind to strangers, blind to people it sees every single week. There is a test for that blindness. It is 2,000 years old. It takes place at a front door. And the Apostle James watched it happen so many times, he wrote it into the Bible. The book of James comes to us from the brother of Jesus, and it reads like a man who has run out of patience with religious talk. James is the New Testament's blunt instrument. Faith without deeds is dead. The tongue is a fire. And in his second chapter, he films a scene with words so precise that 2,000 years later, you can still watch it happen. Two men arrive at a Christian gathering. He says, "Suppose a man comes in wearing a gold ring and fine clothes, and a poor man in filthy old clothes also comes in." Feel how specific this is. James did not write, "Suppose the rich are honored." He staged it. The gold ring, which in the Roman world was a legal marker of rank, worn by the class of men who funded buildings and held office. The fine clothes, which in the Greek literally means shining, bright, a man who catches light when he moves. And behind him, A poor man whose clothes are described with a word that means dirty. Work-stained. The clothes of a man with one set. Now watch the room. James says, because the room moves. If you show special attention to the man wearing fine clothes and say, here is a good seat for you, but say to the poor man, you stand there, or sit on the floor by my feet. Have you not discriminated among yourselves and become judges with evil thoughts? 2 greetings. And the room has spoken. Nobody voted. Nobody meant harm. The usher who walked the ringed man to a good seat would tell you, honestly, that he was just being welcoming. And James looks at the sum of those honest little movements and refuses to call it hospitality. He calls it a courtroom. You have become judges. He says, the congregation weighed 2 human beings at the door, priced them, and seated them by the price. And judges with evil thoughts is his verdict on a church that would have called itself friendly. Here is why the scene deserves a whole chapter. The sin in it has no author. There is no villain to remove, no policy to repeal. It is 100 small differences flowing in one direction, each one defensible. And the direction is the sin. Communities do not usually decide to stop seeing people. They learn it. The way a family learns to root around a squeaky stair, without one word ever being spoken. So walk through an American congregation and take the census nobody takes. The people a room learns not to see. The elderly man in the 3rd row from the back. He was a deacon here for 20 years. He drove the van. He fixed the furnace. Half the couples in this church were counseled in his living room. His wife died 4 years ago, and the church was magnificent for a month. Casserole, cards, visits. The casseroles stopped, because casseroles stop. And now he arrives 8 minutes early, sits in the same seat, sings every verse, and drives home to a quiet house. He would tell you the church is wonderful. He has not been inside another member's home in 2 years. And no one has noticed that, because noticing is the exact skill the room lost. The widow in the 1st year after. There is a cruelty built into the calendar of grief that almost no one talks about. The funeral is crowded. The 1st month is full of hands. And somewhere around month 4, the world quietly decides you should be surfacing. Right at the moment, the numbness burns off and the real weight arrives. Her phone used to buzz all evening. Now, the loudest thing in the house is the refrigerator. She still comes on Sundays. She has learned to answer the question, how are you doing, with the word fine? Because she has watched. Twice. What happens to a face when she answers it honestly? The family that costs money to know. Their car announces them before the door opens. Their kids cycle through the same 3 outfits. And the youngest gets school supplies from the church closet in August. They are greeted warmly every single week, and never invited anywhere. Because every social orbit in this congregation runs through restaurants and lake houses and travel teams. And including them would require someone to quietly redesign an evening. No one is willing to be rude to them. No one is willing to be inconvenienced by them either. And between those 2 unwillingnesses, the family floats. The man with the disability that makes conversations slow. People are kind to him in the way people are kind to a task. Big smiles, short sentences, a hand on the shoulder, and then released. Because the hallway rewards efficiency and he is not efficient. In 11 years, no one has asked his opinion about anything. The socially awkward one. Every church has him. He stands too close. misses the exit ramps of a conversation. Answers, "How are you?" with actual information. There is no program for him. There is only the moment, repeated every week. When he approaches a circle and the circle performs its imperceptible close, shoulders shifting 2 degrees, and he adjusts course and pretends he was headed to the coffee anyway. He is not oblivious. That is the detail everyone gets wrong. The awkward are usually the most fluent readers of rejection in the building. They have had the most practice. And the one who stopped coming. Somewhere in the membership roll is a name that was in a seat 40 Sundays a year, and then was not. It took 3 weeks before anyone said her name out loud. And the sentence was, "Has anyone seen?" The sentence was not followed by a phone call. She had been slipping for months. Shorter conversations. Leaving right after the last song. And the room, which can read 1,000 small signals when it wants to, read none of hers. She did not leave the church angry. She left it unobserved, which is worse, because anger at least believes it would have mattered. Not one of these people has been wronged, in the sense that a court would recognize. That is what makes James so uncomfortable. He is not writing about persecution. He is writing about attention, about the fact that attention is the first currency of love, and every room spends it somewhere. Watch where any congregation's attention flows for 1 month. Who gets approached? Who gets asked? Who gets remembered? And you will have an accurate map of what that room actually believes about the worth of people. The mission statement is what the church says. The hallway is what it believes. And James will not allow the escape hatch of calling this a minor issue, a matter of manners. He anchors it to the throne room. Listen, my dear brothers and sisters. Has not God chosen those who are poor in the eyes of the world to be rich in faith? The people the room price is lowest are the people God has a habit of choosing. Get the pricing wrong, and you are not just being impolite. You are contradicting God's appraisal in public. Weakly, with a smile. And then James closes the trap with the very verse this whole video hangs on. If you really keep the royal law found in Scripture, love your neighbor as yourself, you are doing right. But if you show favoritism, you sin. The royal law. James reached for the second great commandment and held it up against a seating chart, which tells you exactly where he believed the commandment was meant to be tested. Not in the heart. At the door. Now, a fair listener pushes back here, and the pushback deserves an answer. Fine. The room has blind spots. Every room of humans does. But these are failures of 100 small instincts. You cannot fix an instinct with a sermon. What is a community supposed to actually do? That question is not modern. It is almost as old as the church itself. And the first time it was asked at full scale, the church was weeks old, thousands of members deep, and the people being overlooked were widows. And the whole thing nearly cracked the movement in half before the apostles did something about it that no one saw coming. The church in Jerusalem was the most successful community in the history of religion, and it was about 6 months old. Acts describes it in sentences that still sound impossible. 3,000 baptized in a day, then more, daily. Believers selling property and laying the money at the apostles' feet so that, and Luke records this as plain fact, there were no needy persons among them. Thousands of people, one heart, shared tables, shared wallets. Every experiment in human community since has been chasing that paragraph. And then Acts chapter 6 opens with a sentence that begins, "In those days, when the number of disciples was increasing, and you brace for another miracle. And instead you get this. The Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. A complaint about food logistics. In the middle of the book of Acts, between an angel opening a prison and a man seeing heaven, sits a dispute about the meal delivery schedule. And Luke, who chose every scene in this book, decided this one made the cut. It made the cut because of what it nearly did and what it revealed. Understand who these two groups were, because the fault line matters. The Hebraic Jews were the locals, Aramaic speakers, raised in the land, native to Jerusalem and its rhythms. The Hellenistic Jews were the ones who had grown up scattered across the Greek-speaking world. Alexandria, Cyprus, Asia, and had returned. Many were elderly, or came with elderly parents. Devout Jews in their later years moved back to Jerusalem to die near the temple, which meant the city was full of widows, far from any family. And the Greek-speaking widows were the farthest from help of anyone. Same faith, same church, different language, different accent, different kitchens, and a thin, the silent membrane between the two communities that everyone could feel and no one had named. The church fed its widows daily. This was the second great commandment, running as infrastructure. And somewhere in that beautiful system, the Greek-speaking widows started coming up short. Fewer portions, missed lists. The overlooked ones were, notice, the exact profile from the last chapter. Elderly, foreign accented, poor, no husband to speak for them, no local family to make noise. The people a room learns not to see, being not seen, inside the most loving community on earth. Stop on that before the solution arrives, because it is the reason this story is in the Bible. This was the Church of Pentecost. These people had watched the Spirit fall. They held property loosely, prayed constantly, ate in each other's homes with glad and sincere hearts. And favoritism got in anyway, running down the oldest crack in the human world, the line between us and almost us. No one decided to shortchange the Greek widows. No decision was ever the mechanism. The servers were Hebraic. The lists were Hebraic. The mental map of who needs what was drawn by locals, and people notice their own. That is the entire crime. A network doing what networks do, and old women going hungry at the edge of it. Now watch what did not happen. Because every wrong response the modern church has since perfected was available that day. The apostles did not deny it. Nobody stood up and said, "We are a loving church. This cannot be true." Nobody demanded the widows assume good intentions. They did not spiritualize it. No one told the Greek speakers that food is temporary and the word is eternal, that they should fix their eyes on things above. 12 men who had heard Jesus say, "I was hungry and you fed me," were not going to tell hungry widows to be less carnal about lunch. And they did not minimize it. No one called it a communication issue or growing pains. The 12 treated a food roster complaint from the least influential people in the church as a matter requiring the full leadership, a public assembly, and a structural answer, which tells you what they believed was actually at stake. It was not lunch. It was whether the sentence "no needy persons among them" was going to stay true, or become a slogan. Here is what they did. They gathered all the disciples and said, "Choose 7 men from among you who are known to be full of the Spirit and wisdom. We will turn this responsibility over to them. Then the community chose the 7, and Luke lists their names. And the list is the quiet thunderclap of the whole chapter. Stephen, Philip, Prochorus, Nicanor, Timon, Parmenas, Nicholas from Antioch. Run down that list again. Every name on it is Greek. All 7, and the 7th, Nicholas, was not even born a Jew. Luke calls him a convert from Antioch. Sit with what that list is telling you. The overlooked party was the Greek-speaking minority, and the church put the entire food ministry, the money, the lists, the daily decisions, into the hands of 7 men whose names came from the Greek-speaking world. Men close to the overlooked widows. Men who spoke their language and knew their doors. The majority did not form a committee to study the minority's complaint. The community handed the ministry to the side of the room where the neglect had landed. Whatever bias had grown in the old network was going to have a hard time surviving in the new one, because the new one was built out of the people the bias had been running against. That is what taking love seriously looked like. Not a sermon on unity, though the apostles could have preached one that would still be quoted today. A new org chart, named men, transferred authority, a redesigned system, in public, on the record. And this is the verse this chapter exists to underline. Loving your neighbor. At the scale of a community, sometimes cannot be done with intentions. It has to be done with structure. Goodwill did not feed the Greek widows. Goodwill had been present the entire time the Greek widows were going hungry. What fed them was a change in how the community actually operated. Who counted? Who decided? Whose hands held the lists? There are moments when the second great commandment stops sounding like a feeling and starts looking like an administrative decision. And Acts 6 is the Bible's permanent witness that such a moment is not a distraction from the church's calling. It is the calling applied. One more verse, because Luke wrote down what followed. The word of God spread. The number of disciples in Jerusalem increased rapidly, and a large number of priests became obedient to the faith. Priests, Templar professionals, the hardest audience in the city. Luke sets that sentence directly after the food ministry reorganization. Growth stacked against repair on the same page, and the placement invites you to read them together. A church handled an internal injustice honestly, rebuilt itself around its least powerful members, and kept growing in the one city where everyone was watching. The repair did not interrupt the mission. The repair was part of the sermon. So, a community can drift into blindness, and a community can organize its way back into sight. That is the hopeful reading of Acts 6. And it is true, but there is a harder room than that one, because the widows were overlooked by accident, by a system, by nobody in particular. The wound had no face on it, and most of the deepest wounds carried into American churches this Sunday do have a face, a specific person, with a name, who prayed out loud in the same small group, who knew exactly what they were doing. The gossip that traveled dressed as a prayer request, the leader who was trusted and should not have been, the friend from the front row who testified against you when the marriage ended. What happens when the person who broke you is a believer? What do the 2 greatest commandments require then? And what do they mercifully not require? Jesus answered that question directly, in detail, with a procedure, and it is the most ignored instruction manual in the New Testament. There is a kind of pain that only church people know. and the people who carry it can describe the exact moment it arrived. For one woman, it was a Tuesday, when a friend called to gently let her know what was being said about her marriage in a prayer chain she was not part of. Her private struggle had traveled through 4 households, dressed the entire way as a prayer request, gathering detail at every stop. The people discussing her would have been offended to hear it called gossip. They were concerned, and she learned, in one phone call, that the room where she had felt safest had a back channel, and she was on it. For one man, it was the Sunday he watched an elder he had followed for 15 years. A man who had dedicated his children and buried his father, to get quietly moved to another campus after the accusations were found credible. No announcement, no acknowledgement. A sentence in the bulletin about a new season of ministry. He stayed in his seat that morning while the band played, doing math in his head about everything else he might have been wrong about. Ask the people who have walked away from American churches what happened, and you will hear about doctrine, about drift, about beliefs that changed. All of that is real, but sit with them longer. Past the first answers. And again the conversation arrives at a person, a name, someone inside the faith who did the damage. Which is precisely why the damage went so deep. Getting hurt by the world is expected. The world never claimed to be your family. When the wound comes from inside the household of God, it arrives with a second blade, because it cuts the nerve that connected you to the whole thing. If that man is what this faith produces, the wound whispers, then what exactly have I given my life to? Church hurt is never just hurt. It is hurt plus doubt. And the doubt is often the part that never heals. Here is what most wounded believers assume. They assume Jesus did not see this coming. That the New Testament is a book about loving enemies out in the world. And that conflict inside the family is a modern malfunction. Something that started when churches got big and pastors got platforms. Then you open Matthew chapter 18, and you find that Jesus left instructions, detailed ones, a procedure, with steps, for the specific situation of one believer sinning against another. Feel the weight of the fact that the procedure exists. You do not write a fire escape plan for a building you believe cannot burn. Jesus, in the middle of his ministry, with his own disciples jockeying for rank and about to scatter on his worst night, looked down the centuries at every congregation that would ever gather in his name and legislated for the day they would wound each other. He was not surprised by your church. He has never once been surprised by a church. Now, walk the steps, slowly, because every step is doing something. Step 1. If your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out their fault, just between the two of you. 2 commands are hiding in that sentence, and American church culture breaks both of them in opposite direction. The first command is go, not absorb it. Not decide it would be unspiritual to make a fuss. Not carry it silently for 6 years while it ferments into contempt. The offended person is told to move toward the offender, which means Jesus considers the wound worth addressing. Out loud, by name. Silence is not on the menu, and the silence that calls itself grace, the smiling, seething, keeping of accounts, is just conflict with better manners. The second command is the phrase between the two of you, not the group text, not 3 friends consulted for perspective, not a prayer request engineered to inform the room. The circle of the conversation is commanded to match the circle of the offense, which, if any church actually practiced it, would end the gossip economy overnight. Because the gossip economy runs entirely on step one being skipped. And notice the aim Jesus attaches. If they listen to you, you have won them over. Won them over. The goal of the confrontation is not victory, not an apology extracted for the record. The goal is getting your person back. The entire procedure is a rescue operation, wearing the clothes of a confrontation. Step 2. If they will not listen, take 1 or 2 others along, not as an ambush. In the law of Moses, every matter had to be established by 2 or 3 witnesses. And Jesus is pulling that protection into the church. Witnesses keep the offender from rewriting the story. And notice, they keep the offended honest too. Because sometimes the 1 or 2 others listen to both sides and say, "Brother, you are not seeing this straight." The step protects everyone from the most dangerous judge in any conflict, which is a hurt person alone with their own narrative. Step 3. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church, the whole community, because some harm is a community matter, and pretending otherwise just privatizes the damage onto the victim. And if the person refuses to listen, even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector, which is to say, the relationship as it was cannot continue. The pretending is over. The person has chosen distance, and the church is permitted to acknowledge the distance. Read cold. That final step sounds harsh. Read it warmer. Every step of this procedure is engineered to be unnecessary. The whole machine is built with off-ramps, hoping to die at step 1. In a private conversation where a friend says I was wrong and the thing ends with nobody else ever knowing. The procedure escalates only as fast as the refusal escalates. And even the last line has a trapdoor of mercy in it. Because look at who is speaking. How did Jesus treat pagans and tax collectors? He ate dinner with them. He called one to be an apostle. The very apostle in whose gospel this instruction is recorded. Even excommunication, in the mouth of Jesus, is not disposal. It is a change of category, from family member in good standing to mission field. Someone the door still watches for. But the procedure, for all its wisdom, is not the hardest teaching in Matthew 18. The hardest teaching is what comes immediately after it. Because Peter was listening to all this, and Peter could count. Lord, how many times shall I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times. Peter thought he was being generous, and by the standards of the day, he was. The traditional number was 3. He doubled it and added 1. And Jesus said, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. A number that is not a number. A way of saying, stop counting. The counting is the problem. And then he told a story about a servant forgiven, a debt of millions, who walked outside and choked a man over pocket change. The math of the kingdom, Jesus insists, runs on what you have been forgiven, not on what you are owed. And right here, at 77 times, is where wounded people quietly leave the room, because they have been handed that verse before, usually by someone who benefited from how it was being used. Forgive means it never happened. Forgive means he gets the keys back. Forgive means stop bringing it up. Stop protecting yourself. Stop remembering. If that is forgiveness, then forgiveness is just injury with a Bible verse holding the door open for the next one. So, take the distinction that was set down 3 chapters ago and bring it into this room, because this room is what it was saved for. Forgiveness and trust are two different things, and they run on two different clocks. Forgiveness is something you give. It is the decision before God to take the debt off your books, to release your claim on revenge, to stop paying interest on someone else's sin. It can be done unilaterally. It can be done from a distance. It can be done, if it must, at a graveside. It costs you everything and requires nothing from the other person, which is why Jesus can command it without limit. 77 times refers to this. Trust is something the other person rebuilds. It is earned back the way it was lost, slowly, through changed behavior sustained over time. And it is not owed to anyone as a shortcut. The woman from the prayer chain can fully forgive those 4 households and never again hand them information. The church that forgave its elder can forgive him completely and still never return him to a position of power over people. Nothing in Matthew 18 requires the restoration of access. The procedure itself proves it, because the procedure ends, in the hardest case, with forgiveness and distance existing at the same time. Say it in one line, because someone watching needs the one line. Forgiveness is free. Trust has a price, and the person who broke it is the one who pays. Here is the strange hope buried in this whole hard chapter. Jesus wrote a conflict procedure into the constitution of his church, which means conflict inside the church does not falsify the church. What would falsify it is a community that no longer bothers with the procedure, that just gossips and ghosts and quietly reseats itself every few years, managing its wounds instead of healing them. The presence of conflict was assumed. The presence of repair is the test. And there is one night in the Gospels where all of it, the love, the failure, the status games, the betrayal already in motion, sat down together at a single table. What Jesus did at that table in the next few hours became the picture every church since has tried to live up to. And what one church did to that same table 25 years later made the Apostle Paul angrier than almost anything else in his letters. If you want to know what a community actually believes, do not read its statement of faith. Watch its table. Every culture knows this instinctively. Who is invited? Who sits where? Who is served first? Who does the serving? Who eats well and who eats last? A table is a belief system with food on it. And it is no accident that on the last night of his life, with hours left and every word costing him, Jesus did not give his disciples a document. He gave them a meal. John chapter 13 sets the scene with details that hurt more the closer you look. The evening meal was in progress. Judas had already decided, and the disciples, this same night, according to Luke, had been arguing about which of them was considered greatest. Hours from the cross, the 12 are running a status contest. Nobody had washed feet, and everybody knew it. Because in that world, foot washing was the job that told you where the bottom was. Roads were dust and animal filth. Sandals were straps. And washing the feet of arriving guests was work so low that it belonged to the lowest slave in the household. There was no slave in the room. There was a basin, a towel, and 12 men, every one of whom could see the basin, and every one of whom had just been arguing about rank. You do not reach for the towel while the argument is live. The towel concedes the argument. Then, John writes, Jesus got up from the meal. He took off his outer clothing and wrapped a towel around his waist and poured water into a basin and began to wash his disciples' feet. The teacher, stripped to the dress of a slave, on his knees, working down the row. Feel the room. The argument about greatness dying in every throat. Peter, mortified, trying to refuse, "You shall never wash my feet." Because Peter would rather lose the intimacy than watch the hierarchy invert. Jesus washing anyway. And, do not skip this, washing the feet of Judas. The betrayal was already purchased. Jesus knew. John says so twice. And Judas's feet got the same water. When he finished, he put on his clothes and returned to his place, and asked them, "Do you understand what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also should wash one another's feet. I have set you an example." That is the table as Jesus left it. Status voluntarily face down in the dirt. The greatest in the room doing the slave's job, while the slave's job was beneath everyone else present. And a command attached, not admiring this. Do this. Now travel 25 years and 800 miles. To Corinth, to a church, Paul planted himself. And watch what happened to the table. The early church's worship centered on a full meal. Not a silver tray of thimbles passed down a pew. An actual supper in somebody's home, with the bread and the cup embedded in it. And in Corinth, that home would have belonged to one of the few wealthy members, because only the wealthy had a house big enough, which meant the Lord's Supper, the meal of the one body, got poured into the container of a Roman dinner party. And Roman dinner parties had rules, and everyone knew them. The host's inner circle ate in the dining room, reclining. The good food, the good wine. Lesser guests overflowed into the courtyard, standing room. And Roman writers describe it as ordinary etiquette to serve different food to different ranks under the same roof. The empire ranked people at dinner. That is simply what a table was for. The Corinthian church kept the custom and lost the plot. The wealthy members, who controlled their own schedules, arrived early and went ahead with their own dinners. By the time the working members got free, the slaves, the laborers, the people whose hours belonged to someone else, the food was gone. Paul states the result in one of the most brutal sentences he ever wrote to a church. One remains hungry, another gets drunk. At the Lord's Supper, one member of the body of Christ drunk in the dining room, another member standing in the courtyard of the same house, hungry, watching the meal Jesus instituted on the night of the basin and the towel, reorganized by class within a single generation. Hear how angry Paul is, because he does not do what modern conflict avoidance would do. He does not commend their faithfulness in gathering and gently suggest a scheduling adjustment. He writes, "Your meetings do more harm than good." He writes, "When you come together, it is not the Lord's Supper you eat." An astonishing sentence. The apostle telling a church that the sacrament they think they are celebrating is not occurring, because the thing happening at their table cancels it. And then the line under which every church potluck, every members' meeting, every seating decision since has stood. Do you despise the church of God by humiliating those who have nothing? Those who have nothing. Paul saw exactly what the table was announcing. The hungry man in the courtyard was learning, at the Lord's own meal, what this community actually believed his worth to be. The table was telling the truth about Corinth, and the truth was Roman. This is why Paul, in the very next paragraph, does something pastors quote at every communion service without noticing where it came from. He retells the Last Supper. On the night he was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took bread. That tradition, the words of institution recited in every church on earth this Sunday, appears in Scripture not as liturgy, but as a correction, aimed at a specific dining room in Corinth, where rich Christians were eating in front of the hungry. Paul is holding one table up against the other. Here is the table as he left it, the towel, the basin, the body given. Look at what you have built on top of it. And his prescribed examination lands differently once you know the context. Everyone ought to examine themselves before they eat of the bread and drink from the cup. For those who eat and drink without discerning the body, eat and drink judgment on themselves. Generations of Christians have heard discerning the body as a call to private introspection, to inventorying your personal sins before the tray comes down the row. Read the whole letter. And notice what Paul keeps calling the body. You are the body of Christ. He will write 2 chapters later. And he means the people. The failure at Corinth was not insufficient private reverence. The failure was eating without discerning the body, without seeing, registering, the actual brothers and sisters at the table and in the courtyard. The examination Paul commands reaches past private inventory. It asks, who is hungry in this room while I am full? Put the 2 tables side by side one last time, because together they form the test this whole video has been building. At the first table, the highest-ranking person in the room went lowest, voluntarily, and washed the feet of the man betraying him. At the Corinthian table, rank reasserted itself the moment nobody was correcting it, and the meal of unity became a weekly reenactment of the empire's pecking order, with religious words draped over it. Every Christian community on earth is, at every moment, drifting toward one of those 2 tables. The drift toward Corinth requires no decision, no villain, no memo. It is gravity. Status flows. Comfort clusters. The schedule favors the free. The room favors the ringed hand. And everyone is being perfectly polite the entire way down. The drift toward the upper room requires what it required the first time. Someone with status choosing to spend it face down over someone else's feet. Which raises the question that has been walking behind this video since the hallway in the opening scene. If the table tells the truth, and the hallway tells the truth, and the watching world can read both, then everything a church does in public is testimony, one way or the other. Jesus knew that, and on the same night as the basin and the towel, in the same room, he said so. Out loud, in a single sentence that handed the entire watching world the right to judge his movement by one measure. Not its doctrine, not its size. One measure. The next chapter is that sentence. That sentence is coming, and it deserves its own chapter, because it may be the most reckless thing Jesus ever said. But before this video hands it to you, something practical has to happen first. Because look at the ground covered so far. A commandment welded to a commandment. A road to Jericho. A seating chart in James. A food roster in Jerusalem. A procedure in Matthew 18. 2 tables. It is a lot to carry. And on Tuesday afternoon, in the middle of an actual situation with an actual person, nobody can carry all of it. Wisdom that cannot be reached in under a minute is wisdom that will not be used. So here is the whole video. Folded 2 questions, asked in order, every time. What does loving God require here? What does loving my neighbor require here? That is the entire tool. It works because it is nothing more than the two commandments turned into questions. And because the second question refuses to let the first one float away into feelings. Watch it run on 3 situations this video has already visited. Because the tool is only worth having if it works on real material. First situation, the disagreement. The one from the parking lot. The group text. The argument in your church that everyone is managing and no one is having. You are sitting in your car afterward, and the reply is already composing itself in your chest. And it is a good reply. It has evidence. Run the questions. What does loving God require here? Truth. It really does. If you believe something is wrong, loving God does not permit you to smile and starve the conviction until it dies. God has never once been honored by a lie that kept a room comfortable. So, the first question tells you the conversation has to happen. Then, the second, what does loving my neighbor require here? It requires that the conversation happen to their face and not about them. It requires you to state their view so accurately they would sign it. Before you argue with it, it requires that your goal, walking in, is a brother won and not a point scored. Notice the 2 answers braided together make something neither makes alone. Truth without the second question becomes cruelty with a verse attached. Kindness without the first question becomes cowardice with a smile. The braid is the obedience. Second situation. The hallway. You are standing in your circle after the service. Coffee in hand. And you catch him in the edge of your vision. The man from chapter 6. Alone by the welcome table. And your circle is warm and closed and the conversation is good. And every instinct you have votes to stay. Run the questions. What does loving God require here? Deuteronomy answered that one already. A God woven into sitting and walking and lying down and getting up is a God who is present in this exact hallway, right now, watching where his people's attention goes. Because attention is the first currency of love, and this room is spending it. And the second, what does loving my neighbor require here? Something embarrassingly small. 6 steps and a sentence. Not a friendship covenant. Not an adoption. 6 steps across a carpet. A handout. A name asked for and then actually remembered. The whole test of chapter 9. The widow. The awkward one. The family with the rattling car. Almost always comes down to this same tiny transaction. Whether somebody crosses the carpet, the priest and the Levite failed a 17-mile road. Most American Christians fail 6 steps of it every Sunday. Holding coffee. Third situation. The wound. The prayer chain. The trusted leader. The name you cannot say without your jaw tightening. It has been 2 years. Or 10. The 2 questions feel almost unaskable here, which is exactly why they matter most here. What does loving God require? Release of the debt. The servant in the parable did not deserve his release either. And that was the point of the story. You were forgiven millions. And this is pocket change to heaven, even though it is a fortune to you. Loving God requires the account closed. The interest payments stopped. Revenge taken off your books and left in his hands, where Scripture says it belonged anyway. And what does loving my neighbor require? Honesty about what happened, spoken through the procedure and not around it. And it permits, remember, distance where trust was broken and never rebuilt, forgiveness free, trust priced, both questions honored. At the same time, in the same wounded life. It can be done. It is the hardest math in the Christian faith. And it can be done. There is the tool. It costs nothing to carry, and it works at hallway speed. And a person who ran those 2 questions a dozen times a day would begin, slowly, without ever noticing the moment it happened, to resemble the Samaritan, and the 7 Greek names, and the man with the towel. Now, one honest warning before the reckless sentence, because the tool has a failure mode. The 2 questions, asked alone, in private, by an individual, will change that individual. But this video's title says community, and a community is not a pile of individuals. It is a system, with tables and rosters and hallways. And chapter 10 already proved that systems can defeat intentions. The 2 questions reach full power only when a room starts asking them together, when the schedule gets built by them, when the greeting team, the budget meeting, the elder board, the potluck sign-up, all sit under the same 2 interrogations. What does loving God require of us here? What does loving our neighbor require of us here? A community that asks those questions out loud, as policy, would start to look strange, visibly strange. Strange enough that people outside it would notice and start asking their own questions about it, which is exactly what Jesus said would happen. Same night as the towel, same room, 1 sentence, and in it, he handed the whole watching world a key to his movement and dared them to use it. The upper room. Late in the evening, the feet are washed, the bread is broken, and Judas has just left. John marks the exit with 3 words that still drop the temperature of the page. And it was night. The door closes behind the betrayer, and something in Jesus seems to unclench. What he says next. He says, "Only to the 11 who remain." And John records it as the beginning of the longest and most intimate teaching in any gospel. "My children," he begins, "I will be with you only a little longer." He has hours. Whatever gets said now is what he most needs them to keep. And here is what he chooses. "A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." Then the sentence this chapter exists for. "By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Read it again, slowly, and feel how strange it is that this sentence gets embroidered on pillows, because it is not a soft saying. It is a public wager. Jesus is hours from execution. His movement is 11 frightened men, one of whom will deny knowing him before sunrise. There is no institution, no book, no building, nothing. And in that moment, he hands the entire watching world, forever, the authority to evaluate his followers, and he specifies the test they should use. By this, everyone will know. Everyone. Outsiders, skeptics, enemies. He is not describing how insiders will feel about each other. He is describing what the world is entitled to look for, and entitled to conclude if they do not find it. Now list what he did not stake the movement on, because the list is the sermon. He did not say, "By your doctrine, everyone will know." Doctrine matters. This whole video has leaned on it. And the man who said, "I am the way," was no relativist, but he knew that correct statements can be recited by a heart that loves nothing, that the scribe in the courtyard had flawless doctrine and stood outside the door. He did not say, "By your buildings," though his followers would one day raise the most beautiful structures on earth. He did not say, "By your music, or your numbers, or your influence with kings," though eras of the church would quietly rewrite the verse in each of those directions and act as though cultural power were the evidence of God's favor. He did not even say, "By your love for me, everyone will know." That is the astonishing omission. Worship, devotion, passion, vertically aimed, all of it invisible to the watching street. All of it, as chapter 4 established, unverifiable from the outside. He staked everything on the one evidence that cannot be faked long-term and cannot be hidden: how his people treat each other. The horizontal became the proof of the vertical, in public, permanently, which means every congregation on earth is making an argument about Jesus every week, before the sermon starts, before a word of doctrine is spoken, and the argument is made in the hallway, at the table, on the roster, in what happens to the man standing alone. Here is the uncomfortable arithmetic of that wager. It cuts both ways, and Jesus knew it when he made it. If they love one another, the world will know, and if they do not, the world will also know, and will draw the conclusion the test entitles them to draw. The church has no appeal against this verdict, because its own founder set the terms, and every era has proved it. Sit down with people who have walked away from American churches, and you will hear about beliefs that faded and convictions that changed. And all of that is real. But keep listening, and again, the story lands on a memory, something they watched believers do to believers. Rarely an argument, almost always a scene. The test ran in some hallway or some meeting, and the result posted, and they read it. But do not let the wager end on its dark side, because Jesus did not make it as a threat. He made it as a strategy. Think about what he was choosing. Every other movement in history has recruited by power, by conquest, by advantage, by promise of gain. Jesus looked at 11 men with no army and no money, on the worst night of his life, and chose visible love between ordinary people as the entire engine of expansion. It is either the most naive decision ever made or the shrewdest, and he was betting his whole movement that watching genuine love is more persuasive to a human being than any argument ever constructed. So the question this chapter leaves hanging is simply this: was he right? That question does not have to float. It can be checked, because the wager ran at full scale, in the least sentimental laboratory imaginable, the Roman Empire, for 3 centuries, against every advantage stacked on the other side, and the results were written down by 3 very different pens. A bishop who buried the dead through a plague and recorded what his people did in the streets. A lawyer in North Africa who wrote down what the pagans of his city were saying about the church, in their own words, and an emperor with the whole world in his hands, writing in plain frustration about a movement he was trying to bury. 3 documents, 3 angles on the same experiment, and the most valuable page of the 3 belongs to the enemy. The first witness is a plague. In the year 249, a disease came out of the east and moved through the Roman Empire like a slow fire, and it burned for more than a decade. Historians call it the Plague of Cyprian, named for the bishop who described it, and his description survives. Violent fever, the body draining itself, eyes bleeding, feet rotting, hearing lost, sight lost. At the height of it, one ancient account claims 5,000 people were dying in Rome in a single day. And even if the real number was a fraction of that, the streets it describes were streets of the dead. Nobody understood contagion, but everybody understood proximity. And so the healthy did the rational thing. They ran. A bishop named Dionysius led the church in Alexandria through those years. And he wrote down what he saw in one of the greatest cities on earth. He was an insider, writing to his own people. And what makes his letter valuable is not neutrality. It is detail. The pagans, he wrote, thrust aside anyone who began to be sick and fled from their dearest. They would throw the sick into the roads before they were dead and treat unburied corpses as dirt, hoping to avert the contagion. Read that again, and do not judge it quickly. Their dearest, fathers carried out of houses still breathing. It was not that Romans were monsters. It was that their entire view of the world gave them no reason to die for a dying stranger, and every reason to run. And so they ran. Then Dionysius describes the other group in the same streets. Most of our brother Christians, he writes, showed unbounded love and loyalty, never sparing themselves. Heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, attending to their every need, ministering to them in Christ. Many, in nursing and curing others, transferred their death to themselves and died in their stead. And then, the sentence that should be read in every church in America: the best of our brothers lost their lives in this manner. And this form of death seemed in no way inferior to martyrdom. Stop on what that community had decided. Dying of plague, caught while washing a stranger's fevered body, counted the same as dying in the arena for the name of Jesus. They had a category for it, which means it happened enough to need a category. And here is the detail that turns this from a touching story into evidence. The Christians did not only nurse their own. The sociologist Rodney Stark, working through the records of these epidemics, argued that this is how an obscure sect became an empire's faith. Basic nursing, vata, food, warmth, presence, cuts death rates dramatically, even with no medicine at all. So pagan households that fled lost their sick at one rate. Sick pagans who fell into Christian care survived at another. And every survivor woke up in a world with a question in it. My gods ran. My family ran. The people who stayed belonged to a God I have been taught to despise. Who is he? Nobody preached to those survivors. The nursing was the sermon. 2 great commandments. Running at full cost. In a plague street. And the watching world could not look away. The second witness is a lawyer. And the page he wrote is really 2 voices on one page. Tertullian of Carthage was a Christian, a convert, one of the sharpest legal minds the early church ever produced. And around the year 200, he wrote a defense of the faith addressed to the empire that was persecuting it. A defense attorney quotes the other side. And that is exactly what Tertullian does. He records what the pagans of his city were saying about the church. On the street, in their own words, and he quotes them directly. See, they say, how they love one another. Hear the tone he preserved. The sentence was not a compliment offered warmly. It was bafflement, spoken by people who found the belief system absurd and the behavior unanswerable. And Tertullian tells us exactly what they were looking at. A common fund, given voluntarily. No compulsion. Spent, he says, on feeding the poor, burying the dead, supporting orphans, the elderly, the shipwrecked, and men condemned to the mines and prisons for the faith. The pagans had clubs with common funds too. Their funds bought banquets. Watching a community spend its banquet money on other people's orphans. The streets of Carthage produced, on their own, the sentence Jesus had predicted in the upper room, almost word for word. By this everyone will know. See how they love one another. The wager, paying out, in the mouths of the other side, preserved by the lawyer who heard them say it. The third witness sat on the throne of the world, and he is the one this whole video opened with. It is time to read his letter properly. Julian became emperor in the year 361, the last pagan to rule Rome. He had been raised around the Christian faith and had renounced it. And he gave his short reign to reviving the old gods and rolling back what he called the Galilean disease. He was no fool and no crude butcher. He fought with policy, with patronage, with his pen. And he understood exactly why the church had won, which is what makes his letters the most valuable hostile testimony in Christian history. Dionysius wrote as a shepherd. Tertullian wrote as a defender. Julian wrote as an enemy with no reason on earth to flatter, and every reason to lie in the other direction. And what he wrote confirms both of them. Writing to Arcesius, his pagan high priest in Galatia, Julian orders the temples of the old gods to start imitating Christian charity. And then, in the middle of the order, he loses his composure on the page. Why do we not observe that it is their benevolence to strangers? He writes, their care for the graves of the dead, and the pretended holiness of their lives that have done most to increase atheism. Atheism was his word for Christianity. And then, the sentence from the opening of this video, in full, it is disgraceful that, when no Jew ever has to beg, and the impious Galileans support not only their own poor, but ours as well. All men see that our people lack aid from us. An emperor, holding the treasury of the known world, writing in plain frustration that he cannot compete with the food distribution of the people he is trying to bury, their benevolence to strangers. He saw the Samaritan pattern and named it in an official letter. He commanded his priests to build a rival welfare system by decree, with imperial grain and imperial wine behind it. It never took, because the thing he was trying to copy was never a system. It was 2 commandments, welded, walking around in several 100,000 ordinary bodies. You can fund a program. You cannot decree a Samaritan. Julian reigned 20 months and died on a Persian battlefield. And with him died the last organized attempt to restore the old gods. Within 2 generations, the faith of the plague nurses was the faith of the empire. Now, step back and look at what these 3 documents have in common, because it is the point of this entire chapter: a shepherd's letter, a lawyer's defense, an emperor's complaint, 3 men who agreed on almost nothing. One wrote to comfort, one wrote to defend, one wrote to destroy, and all 3, from their 3 angles, point at the same target. The way these people treated people, the visible half of the weld, and the testimony gets stronger as it gets more hostile, which is the opposite of how testimony usually works. The insider gave the details. The defender gave the pagan's own words. The enemy gave the confirmation. Because Julian had every motive to report that Christian love was a myth, and instead he ordered his own religion to copy it. The early church did not argue the empire into surrender. It outloved the empire in public. for 300 years, until the empire's own officials were writing memos about it. They had no buildings for most of that time, no political access, no respectability. Meeting in homes, legally suspect, socially despised, every advantage the modern American church prays for, they lacked. And every one of those disadvantages left only one instrument in their hands: the 2 commandments. And the instrument was enough. Which brings this video, finally, back to where it started. A hallway in America. This Sunday, 11:15 in the morning, a church holding every advantage the first believers never had, and one question left to answer. Come back to the hallway. Same building. Same Sunday. Same 11:15. The last chord has faded. The room is warm with coffee and voices, and nothing about the scene has changed. Except you. You have been down the Jericho road since the last time you stood here. You have read the Emperor's Mail. So look again, and notice that the hallway has become legible. You can read it now. The newcomer is still by the welcome table, cup in hand. And now you recognize the scene for what it is. 17 miles of road, compressed into 6 steps of carpet. 3 people have already made the priest's calculation this morning, each in under a second, each with a defensible reason. And he is still standing there, and the calculation is still available to you. And so is the other option, the one that stops. The 2 women who have avoided each other since March pass again near the coffee, eyes finding middle distance. And now you know what you are looking at. Step 1 of Matthew 18. Unattempted. Going on 8 months. Somewhere between them sits a conversation the size of a kitchen table, just between the 2 of you. And every week it goes unhad. The silence compounds like interest. And 2 chairs in this room drift a little farther apart, while everyone politely notices nothing. By the far wall, the man whose company folded last spring is talking with the couple whose renovation just finished. And the conversation is kind and costs nothing and will go nowhere. And you see Corinth in miniature, the dining room and the courtyard, the ancient sorting running quietly under the fellowship. No villain anywhere. Gravity, doing all the work, and near the door, leaving early again. The widow. Month 9. The casseroles stopped in month 2. This morning somebody asked how she was doing and had accepted the word fine at face value, with relief. And she is halfway to the parking lot. And there is still time. This week, for somebody to fail to accept it. The room is not worse than other rooms. That was never the claim. The room is ordinary. And that is the claim. Because the 2 greatest commandments were never scheduled for extraordinary rooms. Nobody watching this will likely stand in a plague street. The road assigned to most American Christians is carpeted, well lit, and 17 steps long, and it is walked every Sunday at 11:15, and the priest and the Levite pass down it, holding coffee, and the whole ancient drama runs on a loop in a building with a steeple on it. Now, one last time, the scribe. He has been waiting in this video since chapter 2. Standing in the temple courtyard with the smoke rising behind him. The man who got the answer right. Remember how right he got it. Love God with everything. Love neighbor as self. This outweighs all burnt offerings and sacrifices. Said out loud, in the sacrifice yard, with the fires going, and remember what Jesus gave him. Not far. You are not far from the kingdom of God. Mark never finishes him. No name, no ending, no verse that says whether he crossed the distance. Scholars have wondered why Mark preserved the scene at all. An anonymous scribe in a chapter of traps. And maybe the answer is that Mark left him unfinished on purpose. Because unfinished, he holds the door open for every reader after him. He is the permanent occupant of the space between knowing and living. And that space is where this entire video has been set. Because look at the geography of not far. What remained between that man and the kingdom was not information. He had all of it, ranked correctly, defended publicly. What remained was the doing. And the doing is small. And the smallness is the scandal. The distance between him and the kingdom was the width of a hallway. 6 steps of carpet. 1 honest conversation before the drive home. 1 casserole in month 9 instead of month 1. 1 name remembered and used the following Sunday. 1 chair added. 1 call made. 1 debt released. 1 towel picked up, while the argument about who is greatest is still technically live. That has been the strange discovery down every mile of this road. Not one thing in this video was hidden. The commandments were in the scroll boxes on the door frames. The Samaritan is a highway sign now. The letters of the ancient world are published, translated, free online. Every church in America owns the whole file. The hard part was never the knowing. And the early believers, who knew far less, with no New Testament bound in leather, no seminarios, no bandwidth, walked into plague houses on the strength of 2 sentences, and an empire changed its mind. So the ending of this video cannot be an instruction, because there is no missing instruction. It can only be the question the Courtyard has been asking for 2,000 years. Handed now to the one room you can actually do something about. Your community knows the 2 greatest commandments. It could recite them this morning without a stumble, and mean them. Not far, the scribe stood there, 1 step from the door, holding the right answer, and the record goes silent. And the silence was never about him. It is the space Mark left for the rest of us to answer in. Somewhere in your hallway this Sunday. 11:15. Coffee cooling in a paper cup. Someone is standing alone. And the distance between your circle and that spot is the distance between knowing and living. Which is to say, the distance between not far and inside. It has always been 6 steps wide. Love God. Love your neighbor. The second one is how anybody, including you, will ever see the first. The room is right there,